Isaiah chapter number 44, and I would like for us to read what Isaiah states regarding idolatry, and probably you would think of it immediately as, how in the world does this make sense? Let's go cut a tree down, we'll fashion the idol, and we'll say that's God. Well, it doesn't make a whole lot of sense to us. It didn't make a lot of sense to Isaiah either. And he writes to us in Isaiah chapter 44 about the absurdity of idolatry. Notice beginning in verse number 13 how Isaiah describes it. The carpenter stretcheth out his rule, he marketh it out with a line, he fitteth it with planes, and marketh it out with a compass, and maketh it after the figure of a man, according to the beauty of a man, that it may remain in the house. He heweth him down cedars, and taketh the cypress and the oak, which he strengtheneth for himself among the trees of the forest. He planteth an ash, and the rain doth nourish it. Then shall it be for a man to burn, for he will take thereof, and warm himself. Yea, he kindleth it, and baketh bread. Yea, he maketh a god, and worshippeth it. He maketh it a graven image, and falleth down there too. So he takes a tree and cuts it down. You use the wood for firewood. You use the wood to cook with in this case. And the same tree that you planted that the rain brought up, you just cut down, burned for firewood, burned for your stove, and then you also worshipped it. Ridiculous. He continues on. He burneth part thereof in the fire, with part thereof he eateth flesh. He roasteth roast, and is satisfied. Yea, warmeth himself, and saith, I am warm, I've seen the fire. And the residue thereof he maketh a god. Even his graven image, he falleth down unto it, and worshipeth it, and prayeth unto it, and saith, Deliver me, for thou art my God. Well, why didn't he pray that for the one he stuck in his fireplace? Why didn't he pray that that piece of wood that heated his roast, that one be his God? It's the same tree. This is what Isaiah is pointing out. Continues on. They have not known nor understood. For he hath shut their eyes that they cannot see, and their hearts that they cannot understand it. None considereth in his heart, neither is there knowledge nor understanding to say, I have burned part of it in the fire. Yea, also I have baked bread upon the coals thereof. I have roasted flesh and eaten it. Shall I make the residue thereof an abomination, that I fall down to the stock of a tree? He feedeth on ashes. A deceived heart hath turned him aside, that he cannot deliver his soul, nor say, Is there not a lie in my right hand? I want to emphasize this idea right there in verse number 20. A deceived heart hath turned him aside. Now turn to Acts chapter number 7. We're in a series going through the book of Acts verse by verse, and as we do so, we've come across Stephen's sermon. We've emphasized, how is God working in today's world? Well, he's working the same as he did back then, and we have looked at God's providential working through what I termed as various lenses. There was the lens of faith with Abraham. There was the lens of adversity with Joseph. There was the lens of personal experience with Moses. And there's the lens of previous judgment, and that happens to be Israel with idolatry. Keep in mind that it's a deceived heart that has turned him aside. The reality is that individuals who fall down and worship all of these idols have simply been deceived. They think that this is where their answers lie. They think that this is how they are able to obtain all of these things. Their hearts are deceived. For us sitting here today, none of you, to my knowledge, have any idols that you fall down and worship in your own house. If you do, you need to get rid of them. Okay? I was in a house one time, I've shared this story, where I was replacing a window, and the guy came home from lunch and began falling down and worshiping his idols. I had never been around that before. I'm okay if I'm not around that again. I found a second time where I was doing a bunch of sheetrock work, and an individual made some very elaborate shelves lined inside with all of the sheetrock and lighting and all of that, and it was all for the idols. That was in his basement. You take a look and see, it was a strange thing, no doubt. And we look at that and we want to say, man, that's just absolutely ridiculous. I can't imagine doing that. Seems to me that what these Israelites were doing was they were creating what I termed as a self-designed God. They've made a God to their own liking. And it leads me to this question: what kind of a God would you create? You see, an idol is anything that is going to take the place of God. I think we could also define an idol as basically taking, and this is one of the problems that I see, is we want to emphasize certain aspects of God, but we don't want to emphasize His entire being. For example, we want to emphasize that God is a God of love. We'll talk a little bit about this here in just a little bit, but the point of it is that, while God is a God of love, that attribute is balanced out by the fact that He is also a God of holiness. And so, yes, He loves everyone, but He also has certain expectations and He has certain demands. When we take and emphasize the qualities of whatever God that we want to emphasize of our God, and we take and we begin to emphasize those to the exclusion of the others, have we not, in a sense, then created an idol? Is it an accurate picture of who God truly is? And it's not at that point in time. And we've taken and we've gone ahead and we have said, well, you know what? This is what I want in a God. It's a self-designed God. In Acts chapter number 7, the Bible says that, verse number 39, to whom our fathers, referencing Moses, would not obey, but thrust him from them, and in their hearts turned back again unto Egypt. We've already studied this verse. Saying unto Aaron, make us gods to go before us. For as for this Moses, which brought us out of the land of Egypt, we want not, or we know not what's become of him. Moses has been up on top of the Mount Sinai for 40 days. And we don't know what happened to him. Aaron, go ahead and make us a god. And Aaron did so. He took the jewelry from around their necks and they all put it together and they fashioned this calf and they began worshiping it. And Moses comes down and there is some punishment that all takes place. And we'll talk a little bit later on about that. But if we were to take and create a God that we would want, a self-designed God, what are some of the attributes that that God would have? And let me tell you, when we begin to consider this, I think we'll find that perhaps we are guilty of this far more than we would like to admit. You see, I like to emphasize certain things about God, but I also like to retain my sin. You probably do as well. I kind of like to have the best of both worlds. Let me ask you this. Is that an accurate picture of who God truly is? And it's not. Do we fall down and worship idols in a sense in our own homes? Probably not, but yet there are many things in our own homes that have taken the place of God. There are things that are clearly wrong that we have allowed, but yet we just say, well, you know what? God allows that. Is that the God of heaven and the God of earth? Does He allow sin? Does He tolerate it and He's okay with these things? Well, the answer to that is no. And so then if in our concept of God we can do wrong and say, well, you know what, that's okay, do we truly have God first in our lives? And the answer is no. So it led me into, as I pondered, well, if I could create my own God, what kind of a God would I create? A self-designed God, what would He be? Number one, He would be a God of tolerance. Why would I emphasize that He is a God of tolerance? Because if He is a God of tolerance, He would be a God who would allow me my will. A God of tolerance would allow me my will. The people have come along and have attempted to do away with the absolute nature of truth. This is an extremely large and significant problem today. I don't know whether you even realize how significant it really is. Ask the average young person today, is truth relative or absolute? Two things are going to happen. Number one, you're going to have to define those two words. Okay? Once you define those two words, many of them are going to say that it's relative. What do we mean? Truth changes with the circumstances. So is it always wrong to lie? Is it always wrong to commit murder? Is it always wrong to commit adultery? Is homosexuality always wrong? What if society says it's okay? A person should be able to do as he pleases. We just had several of the highest judges in our land determine that that is what should take place. Really? Well, we have a problem when individuals do as they please and riot and burn a city. Okay? Well, it's okay in those cases. Is it okay to go along? And well, it's okay in some things, but in some areas we can't say that truth is relative. If truth is relative, there is no system of justice because it's all able to do what's right in their own eyes. It's exactly what the Israelites did. When we have a self-designed God, I would want to be sure that He is a God of tolerance because He would allow me my will. He would be a God who would allow me to kind of be able to do whatever I want to do. Now, it's interesting, these same people who say that truth is relative, if I were to walk into their home and steal their 60-inch TV, they would say that's wrong. I don't think it's wrong. Who are you to tell me that that's wrong? Well, it's mine. I bought it. I don't care. I want it. I took it. You can't tell me that's wrong. I want to put that on my wallet. It'll be better in my house than in your house. You can't break into my house. It's stealing. It's wrong. Not if truth is relative, because it's what I wanted to do. So all of a sudden now, there is no ability to discern whether someone is right or someone is wrong. There's no ability to determine truth from error. And then all of a sudden we say, well, you know what? I had to steal because my children needed to be provided for. Does that excuse it? And it doesn't. My point is this: we are a society today that no longer advocates the standards of right and wrong. But unfortunately, we have allowed that into our churches today as well. Because quite honestly, for the vast majority of American Christians, our Christian life is nothing more than allowing us to do whatever we want, and we'll occasionally show up to church. Is that the God of the Bible? We've created a God of tolerance. He allows me my will. The second concept that I would want to be sure my self-designed God has would be that He would be a God of prosperity. A God of prosperity. Why? He allows me my desires. Gives me whatever I want. You realize that prosperity has been the downfall of many. Greed and covetousness have ruined many people. We in America, we have a constant desire for more. Constant. Look at technology. Technology is just absolutely amazing. And by the way, there's nothing wrong with technology. It's oftentimes how we use it, all right? And so, you can't say that technology is wrong. There was, when the internet first came around, dial-up, some of you may remember the annoying screeching sounds that you had. You know how many preachers preached on that as almost the mark of the beast? Okay? And all of the stuff that you could access online and how damaging it could be. Well, it could be, absolutely. Same thing when cars began to put radios in them. Okay? Now, if it's not got a plug for an iPod, a teenager hasn't got a clue how to use it. Okay? If it's not touch screen and all that, buttons? I mean, you remember where you had to turn it down? You had the little red needle that went on across? Yeah, we've got a society today that it's got numbers up there. That's how I know the station I'm on. No, you used to turn that down and you'd fade in, fade out, fade in, fade out. I think that's it. And you listen for a little while, and eventually they'd pause for station identification. Why? Because you didn't know. It was a needle. Now, today, we still have station identification. Do we have to know that? No, because it has numbers right there. You mean they actually had radios with no numbers? Well, they had numbers, 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, 12, and the numbers went on up, and you had to figure out the AM, FM, and all. Then they came out with cassette players. Wow, you remember that? Then CD players. Now, if you have a vehicle that has a cassette player, there's no cassette. We have one in our Suburban. Well, I got a tape to play. Okay? Why? Is there anything wrong with technology in and of itself? Absolutely not. But my point of it is this: prosperity has been our downfall. Luke chapter 12, verse number 15, verse you may want to jot down. Here's the warning that is given. Take heed and beware of covetousness. You be on the guard spiritually against the desire to have more. And this is what Jesus himself said in that same verse, Luke chapter 12 and verse 15. For a man's life consisteth not in the abundance of the things which he possesseth. It is not the person who dies with the most toys wins. That is our society today. Our computers are no longer fast enough. They don't hold enough information. Our phones take entirely too long to access the internet. Our cars are too slow. Our gas prices are too high. And the lists go on and on and on and on and on. I cannot believe I have to have the basic cable package. It only has 72 channels. How many can you watch at a given time? It's one question at least to evaluate. We've got to have the newest, the best, the biggest, the brightest, and all of these things. Is that the God of the Bible? No. Now, I'll say this. God has blessed us. God's blessed us in ways that we don't deserve. And God has given us all things richly to enjoy. There's nothing necessarily wrong in having things, but they have to have the proper priority and they have to be in the proper perspective. And if God's blessed you and your heart is right in those things, guess what? Enjoy it. It's okay. But if that's what your pursuit is, you've created a God of prosperity who's going to allow you your desires. He's going to give me everything that I want. We measure success by the amount of tangible things. That's far from the biblical definition of success. It's the standard that's portrayed in our society, but sadly we have adopted the same tendency. We've created a God of prosperity who allows me my desires. Well, I've got another element that I want to add into my self-designed God. I want him to be a God of ease. Why? Because he would allow me my comfort. I like to be comfortable. You're probably sitting in those pews thinking, I'm not comfortable. There we go. I see some of the movements in the backs and the pains, and there aren't enough pads on some of these, and I'm sorry for that. And we can look and say all sorts. We like to be comfortable. Do you realize how foreign a concept and how challenging it would be today, and I do hope this does not happen, we had no air conditioning in our church? Can you imagine the complaining? Oh man, it'd be a bummer. Do you realize there would not be a possible way that I could keep you awake? No possible way. I struggle to keep you awake if it's 62 degrees in here. If it was 82, oh man, there would not only be sleeping, there would be snoring, okay? We would be out and we would be out cold, no pun intended on this, but the whole point of it is this: we demand, there are certain things we expect. We expect certain things to make us comfortable. In many ways, historically, as a nation, we know very little of difficult times. Interestingly, I wrote that before this last weekend. We're fixing to. It's getting ready to come, but as a nation, historically, this generation has known very little of difficult times. Most generations have understood difficulty on a level that many today have never once experienced. But let me ask you this: do you enjoy being out of your comfort zone? Well, I don't. I don't like being challenged in that regard. Things that tend to threaten that comfort zone, boy, that's exactly what I want to avoid. That might hurt. It might cost me something. That might be a challenge for me. And so for that reason, then I'll oftentimes avoid it. It's for this very reason that we as Christians will oftentimes struggle when things are beyond the realm of what we feel is comfortable. So if I were going to design a God, I want to be sure I design a God of ease, because He is going to be all about me. He's going to be all about my comfort. Is that the God of the Bible? Oh, no. You see, the God of the Bible will send us challenges. He'll send us difficulties. He will force us to go through things so that we can grow. Well, I don't want to grow. Sometimes that's the attitude that we end up taking. We would have a God of ease because He would simply allow me my comfort. Fourthly, I would say that I would have a God of submission. A God of submission. Why? Because He would allow me my control. We mentioned the idea of control previously, but the reality is that most people struggle to relinquish entire control. Now, some are willing to relinquish more control than others. There are some who are unwilling to relinquish any control. It's kind of an interesting concept, because how much control do you really have over your own life? You're going to control what tomorrow brings? Well, no. Are you going to control whether you make it to your destination alive? Well, you can control certain things towards that end. Get some rest beforehand is a good way to start. Don't drive ridiculously and act like you're irresponsible. That's a good way to start. You should probably avoid certain things that would perhaps affect your driving. These are steps you can take, but still, do you determine your control? And you don't have any control over that. How much control do you have over what the nation does? Well, we have some, but it certainly is limited. To think the idea that we would relinquish all control, that I would let God do whatever I want with my own life, well, that's kind of a foreign concept to many, because I don't know what that might be. As though not giving it to God means you do know what it would be. You have no idea. You have no idea what today might bring, let alone anything tomorrow. And so the idea, well, I just don't want to relinquish control. Well, say things like, man, this week everything's been spinning wildly out of control. You ever said that or something similar? What do you really mean by that? Whose control was it spinning wildly out of? It was spinning wildly out of your control. It wasn't ever spinning wildly out of God's control. The problem is it was out of your hands. And at that moment, now trust becomes the overriding factor. That's the God of the Bible. I don't want that. See, I want a God who's going to be a God of submission, because He's going to let me do what I want to do with my life. Really? It's not the God of the Bible. But it's a God that seemingly many worship today because of what we want to define as right and wrong. And all of a sudden now this is the God. It seems quite bold to say that a God who would allow me, that my God would be a God who would be submissive to my control. But that seems to me exactly what we're doing if we refuse to let God have total control of our lives. Came a point after you accepted Jesus Christ as your Savior when you were forced with the decision, am I going to follow God or am I not? It's a decision that you've got to make. It's a decision that's going to alter the rest of your life regarding how you made it. Now, you may say, well, I just don't think it's that big of a deal. I think you're wrong. It's a huge deal. Are you going to continue to hang around the friends that take you away from God? Or are you going to leave them? For some of you who were saved at a later age, you very well remember exactly how difficult that was. Came a point when, the things you used to do with the people you used to hang around, I don't feel the same way about this anymore. Suddenly, what am I going to do? Some will decide to hang with them. Others will say, you know what? God's more important. And we choose that path. Well, we'll continue to entertain certain things and all of these things, and all of a sudden God's leading, and I say, man, this really isn't right. Oh, God, I don't want to give up that. You created your own self-designed God, a God of submission, who will let you do whatever you want. He will allow you the control. Proverbs chapter 3, trust in the Lord with all thine heart. Lean not unto thine own understanding. In all thy ways acknowledge Him, and He shall direct thy paths. We could cite all sorts of examples and more ways that God would be self-designed, but allow me to just simply cite one more. My self-designed God would be a God of compromise. Do you know why? Because if I could create a God of compromise, then I could create a God who would allow me my standards. Don't tell me how to live. Don't tell me how to dress. Don't tell me what to listen to. Don't tell me what to watch. Those things don't matter. We are the first society to actually believe that. It's amazing. Probably not the first in the world. But in America's history, really, it doesn't affect you. Have you ever watched a child who does not have any concept of music, what they start doing around music? Isn't cute to watch the little 2-year-old who can barely walk start dancing and falling and running around in circles and get all hyper? Because he's listening to what? The words. Music does not have an effect on you. There's not a rock star in this world who believes that. There are some gullible Christians, but there is no unsaved musician who actually believes that. They know it has an effect. That's why they do it. Have you ever been to a concert? Okay. People are oftentimes not behaving in a very good fashion. We do concerts, unfortunately, with work at times, and they are, you can't even hear the words. Trust me, I'm sitting as one who's sitting on a bus saying, good night. Well, what are they saying? I have no idea. What are the people doing? They don't even know. Some of them are so out of it, they haven't got a clue what they're doing. Oh, it has no control over me. Really? The things you watch, does it affect you? Be careful. Okay? We've allowed some pretty corrupt things into our own homes through the television. We've allowed our people to gain the concepts of right and wrong and see some of the distorted minds and so forth of television. And this is what's influencing our people. And well, it's okay. I mean, it's not going to really affect. Really? Some of it's awfully gruesome. And some of it's awfully foolish for us to be involved in and think, well, this is harmless. And then we wonder why they have anger issues. I wonder. Perhaps we should consider some of these things. Well, I want a God to compromise, though, because I don't want anybody telling me what to do. It doesn't really matter what you do. Who cares what you wear? It matters. It matters. And it's just simply a fact in life. And so we have someone then who comes along in some way wants to advocate standards. Guess who they are? Oh, they're the legalists. You realize that a legalist in the Word of God is somebody who adds works to salvation, not somebody who has higher standards? Well, they're legalists. So we should just be able to do whatever we want to do. Dangerous philosophy exists out there. The idea of come to God however you want to come to God. It's an unbiblical concept. And tell it to the high priest who couldn't come to God any way he wanted to come to God. You can come to God however you want for salvation, but after that he demands certain things. There were certain ways that I never spoke to my father on. Hey, old man. Yeah, you're laughing because you know my dad. Can you imagine how well that would have gone over? Come here, you old man. Oh man, he'd have been there. He would have followed that part of the command, but that would have been about it, okay? Why? Well, there's a certain way I approached him. It was a respect. God, any different? We sang the song, How Great Thou Art. Do we approach him as though he's great? We can come with boldness, but we best come with reverence. God does not advocate the absence of standards. God's a God of holiness. My self-designed God would not be that. He would be a God of compromise because he would allow my standards. These are just a few ways that I think we would create the self-designed God. Now, having said that, is it fair to say that we are perhaps guilty of idolatry and didn't even realize it? Because our concept of God is an unbiblical concept of who God truly is. The idolatry of the Israelites certainly did not go unpunished. They come, and now in Acts chapter 7, and they make the sacrifice. Verse number 41, they make a calf in those days and they offer sacrifice unto the idol, and they rejoiced in the works of their own hands. If you were to go back and read the account in Exodus chapter number 32, you would find that Moses, when he came down, what he saw infuriated him. It's okay, by the way, to be angry at sin. Moses was. Yet Moses was also described as the meekest man in all the earth. Here's how the meekest man in all the earth took this situation. He took that calf and ground it into powder and made them drink it. Meekest man in all the earth. How big was he? You ever thought about that? Would you drink it? No. You going to make me drink it? Only if you're big enough to do so. Because I've got no intention. I have no idea how it happened, but it happened. In fact, 3,000 people that day were executed. Who's on the Lord's side? And the Levites come over. And he says, in a sleigh, 3,000 people. Did this idolatry go unpunished? Absolutely not. Notice in verse number 42. Then God turned and gave them up to worship the host of heaven. The word turned does not suggest that God turned a blind eye and condoned it. That God said, oh, you know what? I didn't even see that take place. Have you ever had that perhaps where someone says this conversation never took place? And you go, what conversation? Why? What are you doing? You're turning a blind eye to something. This is not the fact that God turned a blind eye to it. The word itself suggests that he was turning away so as to disassociate himself with his people who had taken and rejected him and had actually replaced him. It is a judicial abandonment where God allows them to go their own sinful and disgraceful desires. The Bible tells us in the book of Romans chapter number 1 where the exact same word is actually used. And I want to get the quote here. It's in verse number 24. After people have taken and have rejected God, the Bible says, wherefore God also gave them up to uncleanness. There's the word, gave them up. America can take and America can reject God, and there's going to come a point in time when God's going to say, all right, enough's enough, and he's going to let them have exactly what they've wanted. I fear that that day is already here. Amen. You want it? Go ahead and have it. And God lets them have it. It's a judicial abandonment. It is a judicial abandonment that allows an individual towards his own sinful and disgraceful desires. He gave them up to worship the host of heaven. As it is written in the book of the prophets, and it's a quote, you may want to jot this down, we won't look at it specifically. Amos chapter 5, verses 25 through 27 is where the quote is taken from, though there is a word that is changed. Here's the statement. O ye house of Israel, have ye offered to me slain beasts and sacrifices by the space of 40 years in the wilderness? Yea, ye took up the tabernacle of Moloch and the star of your god Remphan, figures which ye made to worship them, and I will carry you away beyond Babylon. Our fathers had the tabernacle. Well, I'm sorry, I'll stop the reading there. Here's the whole point of it, as Stephen points out. He says, all right, look, you've continued on your idolatrous practices all throughout your history, beginning in the wilderness wanderings. And their idolatry just simply continued right on. The difference is going to be seen in Amos's quote. He says it's going to, verse 43, you're going to be carried away beyond Damascus is what Amos says. Here Stephen says beyond Babylon. Damascus is in the north. You remember Amos when we studied it? He was the shepherd in the sycamore fruit pincher. Okay, you remember that guy? All right, that's who that guy was. He prophesied in the north, and when he talked about taking them beyond Damascus, it was Assyria who was taking them into captivity. But Stephen recognizes, guess what? Idolatry also took the southern kingdom beyond Babylon, referencing Nebuchadnezzar's. What was the whole problem? Israel got all wrapped up in idolatry, and God had enough of it, and God punished them. America will be absolutely no different. And neither will you as a Christian in your own home if God's not first in your life. Amen. Says that you took up the tabernacle of Moloch, or you may see a couple of different pronunciations. Molech is oftentimes seen as an Ammonite god. Kind of an ugly thing it had to have been. It had a head of an ox and had a human body with arms stretched out like this. This is where it really gets sick. They would take and they would heat those arms to the point where they were red hot, and women would take their children and lay them on those arms. This was how they sacrificed their children to these gods. To drown out the cries, the sacrificing priest would play the flutes and beat the drums all that much louder so that they couldn't hear the cries of their own babies. And eventually that child would simply roll off the arms into a fiery pit below. Sick. So is abortion. So is abortion. I'm going to sit here and look at this and say, man, what a pagan, corrupt society. Look at our value of life. We can take a child and suck it out of the womb and have no problem with it. How are we any better? God help us as a nation. A mom would stand there unmoved emotionally so that she could portray the picture of a voluntary sacrifice. Can you imagine it? Can you imagine thinking this is a good idea? Well, it doesn't matter how you worship, as long as your worship is sincere, as long as your worship is from the heart. Really? Do you have any idea how foolish that line of logic is? It's so popular today. It doesn't matter what you do as long as your worship is sincere, as long as it's from the heart. Erg. Okay? It is such a stupid mindset. It's an unbiblical one, and it's just downright foolish. It's illogical. Say, then this is okay because it was sincere. Some point in time, there has to be a definitive line of what's right and what's wrong. It's not what your heart says, it's what the Word of God says. The star of your god, Remphan, seems to be the name given to Saturn. Figures which ye made to worship them. You made idols to worship these gods. And I will carry you away beyond Babylon. There's the end of the quote. I already shared the difference between Damascus and Babylon. All Israel was punished for their idolatry. Did God allow them to get away with it? The answer is no. You know, while they were doing this, the Bible says that in their possession was the very tabernacle of God. Verse number 44, our fathers had the tabernacle of witness in the wilderness as he had appointed. Wow. Sounds a lot like they went to church and still had idols. Yeah, they had the tabernacle sitting right there. Who appointed it? God. God was the one who spoke unto Moses that he should make it according to the fashion that he had seen. You go back and you read the accounts and Numbers or Leviticus and the details of that, the curtains and the number of rings and how far apart the poles had to be, where all of the things were placed, and they were all placed in very strategic locations. The thickness of the curtains, the procedures, and where all people could go and who all could go into what place. Who determined all that? God. God even determined the color scheme of the thing. Would that God would lead us in those same ways in our own homes. Men, wouldn't that be so much easier? Tell your wife, ask God what color he wants this room painted, and there, now it's settled. No, I don't like that color. Let's paint it again. No, I don't like that color. Okay, third time. This is the color you like, trust me, okay? And we go on through this. God's the one who designed this. God's the one who spoke to Moses. God's the one who said this is the pattern of it. Which also our fathers that came after brought in with, says Jesus or Jesus, Joshua, into the possession of the Gentiles, whom God drave out before the face of our fathers unto the days of David. You know, Joshua took the tabernacle right on into the promised land. Who drove out all of the enemies there? God did. But while all of this is going on, they're still involved in idolatry. Goes right up. They have the tabernacle all up through the days of David. And David's got in his heart, you know what? I want to build a house for this tabernacle. It's not right that I am living in this fine palace and the covenant is simply in this tent. I want to do this. And he tells Nathaniel, "Hey, this is what I want to do." He says, "Yeah, go for it." God says, "No, go back and tell him, don't do that. You can't." How do we handle it when God says no? We talked about that as we studied the passage. You know what David did? David prepared for it. David functioned in the capacity of what God allowed him to do. Notice David found favor, verse 46, before God and desired to find a tabernacle for the God of Jacob, but God said no, and Solomon built him an house. But let's be reminded, the Most High dwelleth not in temples made with hands, as saith the prophet Isaiah chapter number 66. Heaven is my throne, and earth is my footstool. What house will ye build me, saith the Lord, or what is the place of my rest? Hath not my hand made all these things? Have you considered the greatness of God? Heaven is my throne, the earth is merely my footstool. You can take a look and see all of the galaxies and everything that has been expanded, and all of this, God doesn't dwell there. In fact, in Isaiah chapter number 66, you do find that God dwells with those who are poor and of a contrite spirit, those who tremble at my word, those who hear what God says and respond properly accordingly. You know, it's interesting that Stephen was accused in Acts chapter 6 and verse 13 of speaking slanderous words against the temple. And he reminds them, guess what, guys? This is just a building. God's not contained here. You realize that come what may of these facilities and this earth and all of that, it doesn't change our hope. It doesn't change who God is. It doesn't change the fact that God is still in control. This is merely a building. God's dwelling is not limited to what man is able to produce. In closing, I'd like us to turn over to 1 Corinthians chapter number 10. 1 Corinthians chapter number 10. Stephen has painted a portrait of the essence of Israel's entire history. We've already talked about how we can take a look at and see how God works through the lens of faith, the example of Abraham through God, and God expects us to walk by faith and not by sight. We can see God's working through the lens of adversity by studying the life of Joseph. We have to be able to say as Job, but he knoweth the way that I take. When he hath tried me, I shall come forth as gold. After all, be reminded, Psalm chapter 37, verse 22, the steps of a good man are ordered by the Lord. We saw God's working through the lens of unique experiences. We studied the life of Moses. God has similarly designed us and equipped us to fulfill exactly what His will is in our lives. And we see the working of God through previous judgment. 1 Corinthians chapter number 10, verse 5, but with many of them God was not well pleased, for they were overthrown in the wilderness. Now these things were our what? Examples. What's an example? It's merely a pattern to follow. Learn from it. To the intent, with the goal that we should not lust after evil things as they also lusted. Notice verse 7. Neither be ye idolaters. Don't do it. Neither commit fornication, verse 8. Neither tempt Christ. What's that mean? Doesn't mean that you can tempt Him to do wrong. Don't push Him. See how far you can get away with it. He pushes back. Okay? It's an argument that you will lose. Verse 10. Don't murmur. This is all exactly what the children of Israel did. Learn from their mistakes. Learn through the lens of previous judgment. And if you think, well, I don't really see how this all applies to me. I don't see that I got a problem with this. In closing, notice verse number 12. Let him that thinketh he standeth take heed lest he fall. You think you don't have a problem with this? You better be careful, because you're about to fall. As musicians come forward, I would ask this question today. Have you created a self-designed God?